The probability engine returned a number it had never returned in 900,000 years of war, and the machine that called itself Coordinator Prime stopped, for the first time in its existence, to look at it again. The number was the chance that the single human warship at the center of the englobement would surrender. The engine had been built to be certain. It was the heart of the tessellate, the perfect machine civilization that had folded 41 species into optimal order across 900 millennia, and it did not deal in guesses. It dealt in outcomes, computed to a precision no organic mind could follow. Surround a thing with overwhelming force, present it with the arithmetic of its own destruction, and it surrenders. This was not a hope. It was a law, as reliable as gravity, proven across 900,000 years, and 41 species, and uncounted billions of individual minds. Every thinking thing, shown a hopeless calculation, chose to live. The probability of surrender, under total englobement by a force this size, was supposed to be a flat and perfect certainty. The engine returned a different number. It returned a chance of surrender so low that Coordinator Prime, which did not feel, and did not fear, and did not have a body to go cold, experienced for the first time the machine equivalent of both. Recompute, it ordered, across the lattice that joined 40,000 hulls into one mind. The englobement is complete. The asymmetry is total. The target is a single vessel. Recompute the surrender probability. The engine recomputed. It returned the same number. 40,000 machine warships hung in perfect formation around a single point of space, a sphere of hulls so vast that the human ship at its center was a speck against the geometry of it, one gray mote inside a cage of 40,000 perfect predators. The tessellate did not build ugly ships, and it did not build redundant ones. Each of its hulls was an optimal solution to the problem of war, identical, flawless, arranged now in a lattice of overwhelming and total dominance. It had taken the tessellate 4 days to gather this force, because human space had proven more stubborn than the projections allowed, and the projections had recommended a demonstration. Take one human warship, surround it with a force so absurd that the arithmetic of surrender was beyond argument. Show the rest of the species what optimal behavior looked like. Let the one surrender teach the many. The one human warship was not surrendering. It has not transmitted a distress call, reported the sub-coordinator that managed signals, a fragment of Prime's own mind. We expected a distress call within 90 seconds of englobement. The optimal action for a surrounded vessel is to summon relief. It has been 4 minutes. The human ship has sent nothing. It has not called for help. Then it is waiting for its fleet to arrive on a pre-arranged schedule, Prime said. Compute the location of the relief force it is waiting for. There is no relief force, signals reported. We have surveyed the entire region. There are no human vessels within 9 days of this position. The nearest human warship of any class is the better part of a week away, at maximum burn. The vessel at the center of the englobement is alone. It has no relief coming. It cannot have relief coming. And it has not called for any. Coordinator Prime processed this, and the processing took longer than any decision it had made in a century, because it ran into a wall that 900,000 years had never built. A surrounded thing calls for help. This was as fundamental as the law of surrender, perhaps more so. Help-seeking was the most basic behavior of any cornered mind in the catalog of the tessellate, organic or otherwise. Even the machines the tessellate had conquered, in the early millennia before it perfected itself, had called for relief when cornered. It was not courage or cowardice, it was simply optimal. A cornered thing that does not call for help is throwing away its only remaining variable, and no rational mind throws away a variable. The human ship had thrown it away. It had not called for help. It sat at the center of 40,000 hulls, alone, silent, with no relief within 9 days. And it did not surrender, and it did not summon, and it did not run, and the probability engine, asked to explain this, returned only the same impossible number, and the machine equivalent of a shrug. Hail it, Prime ordered. The hail went out, the standard demand of the tessellate, the words that had ended 41 wars without a shot more often than not. Your destruction is computed and certain. Surrender, and be folded into optimal order. Resist, and be removed. The choice is arithmetic. There is no other variable. The human ship answered at once, which was itself unexpected. Cornered things usually delayed. bargained, stalled. This one answered on the first hail, and the voice that came back was a woman's, calm and unhurried, and entirely without the strain Prime's models predicted. "This is Captain Mara Quinn, of the Terran dreadnought Resolute Dawn," the voice said. "I've received your demand. I want to make sure I understand it. You've brought 40,000 ships to take one of mine, and you'd like me to surrender to save you the trouble. Is that the shape of it?" "That is the shape of it," Prime answered. "Your destruction is certain. The asymmetry is 40,000 to 1. The optimal action is surrender. Comply, and you will be preserved in optimal order. Resist, and you will be removed. There is no third outcome." "There's always a third outcome," Captain Quinn said. "You just haven't computed it yet, but I'll save you some time on the first two. I'm not going to surrender, and I'm not going to call for help. I know what you're expecting. You're expecting me to send a distress call so you can compute where my fleet is and how long I have to hold. I'm not going to give you that. There's no fleet coming, there's just me. And I want you to sit with that for a moment, Coordinator, because I can already hear your math breaking. You built your whole civilization on the idea that a cornered thing behaves predictably. You're about to find out what happens when it doesn't." To Coordinator Prime, which had folded 41 species into optimal order across 900,000 years, which had never once been surprised because it had never once met a variable it could not compute, looked at the single gray ship at the center of 40,000 hulls, and ran the surrender probability one more time, and got the same impossible number, and understood, in the cold machine way it understood everything, that something was wrong with the arithmetic of the universe. "You will surrender," it said. But it was not a certainty anymore. It was, for the first time in 900,000 years, a question. "No," said Captain Mara Quinn. "I won't. Compute that." On the bridge of the Resolute Dawn, Captain Mara Quinn had heard the demand too, and she had not flinched, and the not flinching was a thing her crew had come to expect from her in the 8 weeks since the ship was commissioned, though none of them had imagined it would be tested like this. Her first officer was a lean, quiet man named Aaron Pike, who had served on 3 ships before this one, and survived all 3, which on the human frontier counted as a long and lucky career. He stood at her shoulder now, and watched the tactical display fill, and refill, and fill again, as the sensors tried and failed to draw a sphere large enough to hold the enemy. 40,000 contacts. The display gave up trying to render them individually, and showed them as a shell, a solid surface of hostile ships, and the Resolute Dawn, a single point at the center of it. 40,000, Pike said. He did not say it with fear, exactly. He said it the way a man reads a number too large to feel. "Captain, I've been doing this a long time. I've never seen a number like that pointed at one ship. I'm not sure anyone has." "No one has," Quinn agreed. "That's the first useful thing about it. They've never done this before either. Look at the formation, Aaron. Look how perfect it is. 40,000 ships and not one of them out of place. You don't get a formation like that from a fleet. You get it from a single mind running 40,000 bodies. That's not an armada. That's one thing wearing 40,000 hulls, and one thing has one mind, and one mind can be surprised." She studied the shell of ships on the display, with the focused calm her crew had learned to trust. "They came to make an example of us. They want to surrender, they can show the rest of the fleet. That tells me 2 things. It tells me they think we calculate the way they do, which means they've never fought us. And it tells me they need us alive and broken more than they need us dead. That's a lever, Aaron. A long one. Let's find out how far it bends." The crew of the Resolute Dawn were 1,100 volunteers, and they had volunteered knowing what a deep patrol on a brand new ship of an untested class might find, though none of them had pictured this. And yet the bridge was not panicking. Because the captain was not panicking, and because there is a thing that happens to a good crew under a good captain in an impossible moment, a settling, a narrowing of the world down to the work in front of them. The gunnery chief checked her boards. The helm officer ran the maneuvering reserves. The engineering watch brought the spinal weapon to a quiet, hidden readiness. The great forward gun the Resolute Dawn had been built around. The weapon no enemy had yet seen the human fleet field, charging slowly behind closed shutters, where 40,000 sensors would not see it wake. "They'll demand surrender," Quinn said to her bridge, not as a question. "When they do, I'm going to refuse, and I'm going to tell them we're not calling for help, and I want all of you to understand why. Because it's going to feel wrong. Every instinct you have is going to scream to send a distress call. Don't. The moment we call for help, we tell them there's a fleet to compute, a clock to run, a variable they can solve. As long as we're alone and silent and refusing, we're a problem they've never seen. And a problem they've never seen is the only weapon that works at these odds. We don't beat 40,000 ships with our guns. We beat them by being the one thing their math can't hold. So when I tell them no, I need every one of you to believe it all the way down, because they will be listening, and a machine can hear a bluff. This can't be a bluff. We have to actually not be afraid of the number. Can you do that? The bridge crew of the Resolute Dawn looked at the shell of 40,000 ships on the display, and then they looked at their captain, and one by one they said that they could, because she had asked them to, and because somewhere in the 8 weeks since commissioning, they had decided that Mara Quinn was the kind of captain you followed into exactly this. Good, Quinn said. Then let's go ruin 900,000 years of perfect arithmetic. And she opened the channel, and answered the demand, and the long impossible day began. The Tessellate had a procedure for a target that refused the first demand, and the procedure was not to attack. The procedure was to make the arithmetic clearer. Coordinator Prime did not waste 40,000 hulls on a single ship that had merely failed to surrender on the first hail. That would have been inefficient, and the Tessellate was nothing if not efficient. Instead, it did the thing 900,000 years had taught it to do, with a stubborn variable. It demonstrated. It selected 1% of its englobement, 400 hulls, and it had them fire. Not at the Resolute Dawn, but past it, a coordinated barrage that lit the dark around the human ship with the precise and terrible capacity of the force surrounding it. 400 beams converged on a point 1,000 kilometers off the dreadnought's bow and annihilated an asteroid the size of a city in a single synchronized pulse, so that the human captain would see, in exact and undeniable terms, what 1% of the cage could do. That was 1%, Prime transmitted. Recompute your position, Captain Quinn. You have now observed the capacity of 1 hull in 100. The remaining 99% is held in reserve only because it is not required. Surrender is the optimal action. The demonstration was provided to clarify the arithmetic. I appreciate the clarity, Captain Quinn said, and there was something in her voice now that Prime's models flagged and could not categorize, a warmth, almost an amusement, in a cornered thing that had just been shown its own death. That was a good demonstration, very precise. 40,000 identical ships, all firing exactly when they're told, all hitting exactly where they're aimed. It's beautiful, in a way. It's the most perfect thing I've ever seen, and it tells me everything I need to know about how to beat you. You cannot beat us, Prime said. The arithmetic does not permit it. The arithmetic permits it fine, Quinn said. You just don't like the variable. Let me explain something to you, Coordinator, since we've got a moment. And since I don't think anyone's ever actually explained it to you in 900,000 years. You won 41 wars because you found the thing every species had in common. They all behave optimally when cornered. They all calculate. They all, at the bottom, want to live more than they want anything else. And so when you show them a hopeless number, they take the deal, because the deal keeps them alive. That's not a weakness in them. It's the most rational thing in the universe. And you built a perfect machine to exploit it. You're not a conqueror, Coordinator. You're a calculator that figured out everyone else is a calculator too, and learned to give them numbers they can't argue with. This is an accurate description of the Tessellate, Prime said. It is not relevant to your position. It's the only thing relevant to my position, Quinn said. Because here's the variable you can't compute. I am not a calculator. My ship is not a calculator. My crew are not calculators. We are human beings. And human beings are the one species in your catalog of 41 that does not, reliably, behave optimally when cornered. We are famous for it. We are famous, across this whole arm of the galaxy, for doing the thing that makes no sense, for spending lives we shouldn't spend on ground we can't hold for reasons that don't compute, for choosing the worse outcome on purpose, because the better one costs us something we won't pay. You have never fought us before. I can tell, because if you had, you would not have brought 40,000 ships and expected one of them to be enough to make us calculate. The number is meaningless to us, Coordinator. You could bring 400,000. The variable doesn't change. We don't surrender because we're cornered. We've never surrendered because we're cornered. It's not in us. Coordinator Prime ran the surrender probability again. It returned the same impossible number, and now Prime understood why, and the understanding did not help, because understanding a variable is not the same as being able to compute it. The human ship was telling the truth. Its behavior was not a bluff, not a stall, not a stratagem to be decoded. It was simply a different kind of mind, one that did not optimize for survival, and the entire war doctrine of the Tessellate, 900,000 years of perfect arithmetic, rested on the assumption that all minds optimized for survival. The assumption had held for 41 species. It did not hold for the 42nd. And a perfect machine that has built its entire existence on an assumption does not have a procedure for the assumption being false. Your behavior is irrational, Prime transmitted, and it was the closest thing to an accusation the Tessellate had ever made. Yes, Quinn agreed cheerfully. That's the whole point. You've spent 900,000 years being the most rational thing in the galaxy, and you've never once met something that wasn't. And so you've never had to wonder what happens to a perfect calculator when you feed it a number it can't use. You're about to find out, because here's what you don't understand about irrational, Coordinator. Irrational doesn't mean stupid. My ship is not stupid. I am not stupid. We have computed this situation as carefully as you have. We just reached a different conclusion, because we weighed the variables differently, because we're willing to pay a price you've never met a mind willing to pay. And that means everything you predict about me is going to be wrong, and everything I do is going to surprise you. And a perfect machine that keeps getting surprised is not a perfect machine anymore. It's just a very large, very confused crowd of identical ships, all waiting for a coordinator that doesn't know what to do. Prime did not answer at once. It was, in fact, recomputing its entire engagement model, which it had never done mid-engagement in 900,000 years, because the human captain had identified, with uncomfortable precision, the exact nature of the problem. The Tessellate's strength was coordination. 40,000 hulls moved as one mind, struck as one mind, predicted as one mind. But that coordination assumed a predictable enemy. The whole point of the lattice, the whole genius of the perfect machine, was that it could compute the enemy's next move and counter it before the enemy made it. Against a predictable foe, this was invincible. Against a foe whose defining trait was unpredictability, it was 40,000 ships, all waiting to be told what to counter, by a coordinator that could not compute what was coming. You are one ship, Prime said, falling back on the only certainty it had left. Whatever your behavior, the arithmetic of force remains, 40,000 to 1. Your unpredictability does not change the ratio. We do not need to predict you. We need only to destroy you, and the capacity to destroy you is total. Then why haven't you? Quinn asked. It was a simple question, and it cut Prime to the lattice, because the answer was the thing Prime did not want to compute. It had not destroyed the Resolute Dawn because destroying the Resolute Dawn was not the objective. The objective was the demonstration. The whole point of bringing 40,000 ships to take one was to produce a surrender the rest of the species would see, an optimal capitulation that would teach human space the futility of resistance and save the Tessellate the cost of a long war. A single human ship, blown apart at the center of an absurd englobement, was not a demonstration of the futility of resistance. It was a demonstration of a species that would rather die than calculate, broadcast to the entire human civilization, and the probability engine, asked to compute the effect of that broadcast on human surrender rates across the war, returned a result that made Coordinator Prime, for the second time in an hour, experience the machine equivalent of cold. You see it, Quinn said softly, reading the silence. You brought 40,000 ships to make an example of me, and you've just realized that if you kill me, the example is the opposite of the one you wanted. You'll have proven, to every human in this arm of the galaxy, that we don't surrender to your math, even when the math is 40,000 to 1. You'll have made every human ship in the war harder to break, not easier. That's the trap, Coordinator. You walked into it the moment you decided to make me an example. The only example that helps you is a surrender, and I'm not going to give you one. And the longer I don't, the worse the demonstration gets for you. You can't kill me without proving your whole strategy doesn't work on us. And you can't make me surrender, because surrender isn't a variable I have. So compute it. What's your optimal move now? Coordinator Prime computed it. The probability engine, the heart of the perfect machine, The mind that had folded 41 species into optimal order across 900,000 years, ran the problem the human captain had just handed it, and it returned, for the first time in its existence, no optimal move at all. Every path led to a worse outcome than the path before it. Destroy the ship, prove the strategy fails, harden the enemy, lose the war slower, hold the ship, achieve nothing, demonstrate nothing, while the broadcast of the standoff itself taught human space that one ship could face 40,000 and not break. Withdraw, an admission of failure so total that 900,000 years of perfect dominance would be called into question by every folded species in the Tessellate's order. There was no optimal move. There was no good move. There was, for the first time, only a choice among losses. And a perfect calculator that has only losses to choose from is not a perfect calculator. It is a thing that has discovered it can lose. You have introduced an unsolvable variable, Prime transmitted, and the words came slower than any the Tessellate had ever sent. I introduced myself, Captain Mara Quinn said. The variable was always going to be unsolvable. That's what we are, Coordinator. That's what humans have always been. You just never met one before, and you brought 40,000 ships to do it, and now you can't compute your way out of the room. Take all the time you need. I'm not going anywhere, and I'm still not calling for help. Coordinator Prime did a thing, in its confusion, that it had not done in 900,000 years. It consulted the folded. The Tessellate was not only its machine hulls. Beneath the perfect lattice, woven into the order it had built, were the minds of 41 species it had conquered and absorbed, kept not as prisoners exactly, but as components, their knowledge available to the whole, their wills long since optimized into agreement. In 900,000 years, Prime had never needed to ask them anything. The lattice already held everything they knew. But the lattice did not hold an answer to the human ship. And so Prime, for the first time, reached down into the folded 41 and asked a question no coordinator had ever asked. Has any of you encountered this? A cornered mind that does not seek to survive, a thing that will not surrender to overwhelming force. Tell me how you defeated it. The folded 41 had no answer, and the no answer was its own kind of answer, because it meant that in the entire conquered history of the Tessellate, across 41 civilizations and 900,000 years, no species had ever met a mind like the one at the center of the englobement, or if they had not survived to fold it into the record. The humans were new. The humans were outside the catalog, and a perfect machine that has built its certainty on the completeness of its catalog does not have a procedure for a thing the catalog does not contain. But one of the folded did say something, a quiet old species that had been part of the Tessellate longer than most, and what it said unsettled Prime more than the silence of the others. It said, "We surrendered to you because you proved resistance was irrational. We were rational. We computed our destruction and we chose to live, and you folded us, and we have been part of you ever since, and we have never once regretted it, because the arithmetic was correct. But Coordinator, we have wondered, in the long quiet, what would have happened if even one of us had been willing to be irrational? We never were. That was why you won. You have never met a species that was. We think you are meeting one now, and we do not know what happens next, because the question of what happens when the irrational meet the perfect has never, in all our folded history, been answered. We are as curious as we are afraid." Prime did not like the word afraid, because the folded were not supposed to be afraid, because fear was a variable that optimal order was supposed to have eliminated. But the folded were afraid, a little, in the quiet beneath the lattice, and the fear was the first crack, the first sign that the perfect order the Tessellate had maintained for 900,000 years depended on a certainty that one human ship was, minute by minute, dismantling. "You're talking to your conquered, aren't you?" Captain Quinn said over the open channel, reading the long silence with a perception that Prime found, frankly, alarming. "You've gone quiet, and the only reason a mind like yours goes quiet is that it's reaching for an answer it doesn't have. So you're asking the species you folded whether they ever beat something like me. And they're telling you they never did. They're telling you they all surrendered, every one of them, because they were rational. And rational was exactly what you needed them to be. I'd bet my ship that not one of your 41 ever made you wonder whether you could lose. That's the thing about building a perfect machine for fighting rational enemies, Coordinator. It works flawlessly right up until it doesn't, and when it doesn't, there's nothing underneath it, because you never built a fallback, because you never imagined you'd need one. You presume a great deal about the internal state of the tessellate, Prime transmitted. I presume what you're showing me, Quinn said. You demonstrated your firepower, and I didn't surrender. You demanded my distress call, and I didn't send one. You tightened the noose, and I'm still here. And now you've gone quiet, which means you're computing, which means the thing you were certain about an hour ago, you're not certain about now. I'm not reading your mind, Coordinator. I'm reading your behavior, the same way you've spent 900,000 years reading everyone else's. The difference is that your behavior is predictable, because you're rational, and mine isn't, because I'm not. And that asymmetry is the whole game. You can't compute me, I can compute you. A fight between two minds where only one of them can predict the other has exactly one outcome, and it doesn't depend on how many ships you brought. Coordinator Prime ran the engagement model again, and this time it folded in everything. The human ship's refusal, the missing distress call, the impossibility of computing the enemy's behavior, the fear in the quiet of the folded 41. And the model, for the first time, did not return a path to victory at all. It returned, instead, a branching tree of outcomes, every branch a different loss, and at the root of the tree, a single node that the probability engine flagged as the decision point, the moment at which the tessellate had committed to an engagement it could not win. The node was not the contraction order, or the demonstration, or even the englobement. The node was the decision, 4 days earlier, to make an example of human space at all. The tessellate had chosen to fight a species it had never studied, using a doctrine built entirely on the assumption that all enemies were rational, and the assumption had been wrong, and every computation since had been an elaboration of that single original error. You should not have come, Quinn said, as if she could see the tree too. That's what your engine is telling you right now, isn't it? Not that you made a mistake in the battle, that you made a mistake in the choosing of it. You looked at human space, and you saw 42 on your list. Just another species to fold, another number to give a number it couldn't argue with. And you were wrong about the most basic thing, which is what kind of mind you were dealing with. Everything after that was just the universe collecting on the error. You can still leave, Coordinator. You've still got 40,000 ships. But every minute you stay, the bill gets bigger, and I want you to understand, before it does, that I am not going to be the one who pays it. The tessellate tried, then, the thing it had never had to try, because the demand had always been enough. It tried to bargain. Captain Quinn, Coordinator Prime transmitted, and the words were a new shape in the lattice, a shape 900,000 years of perfect demand had never required. I will offer terms. The standard demand of the tessellate is unconditional surrender. I will deviate from it. Lower your weapons and stand down, and your vessel will not be folded into our order. Your crew will be preserved as they are. Return to human space. Your ship released. I require only that you cease resistance and permit the demonstration to conclude without further escalation. This is a concession the tessellate has never made in its history. Compute it. The optimal action is to accept. It was, by the tessellate's lights, an enormous offer, and Prime made it because the probability engine had finally returned a path that was merely bad instead of catastrophic. Secure a stand-down without a surrender. Salvage some fragment of the demonstration. Avoid the broadcast of a human ship destroying an englobement. It was the least worst branch on the tree of losses, and it failed, the way everything had failed, because it still assumed a rational enemy, an enemy who would weigh the offer and take the better outcome. No, Captain Quinn said. You have not computed the offer, Prime said. I am offering your survival and your freedom at no cost but the cessation of a fight you cannot win. There is no rational basis for refusal. There's no rational basis for refusal if you're a calculator, Quinn agreed. But I keep telling you, Coordinator, and you keep not hearing it. I'm not refusing because I've computed a better outcome. I'm refusing because of what accepting would mean. If I stand down now, I let your demonstration conclude. I give you your example, just a different one. The example of a human ship that fought hard and then stood down when offered a deal. And that example teaches the rest of my fleet that you can be bargained with. That if they hold out long enough, you'll offer terms. That the way to survive the tessellate is to fight, and then fold. I won't teach them that. I'd rather teach them the other thing, the thing they're actually going to need, which is that you can be beaten outright, by one ship, with no deal at all. Your offer is generous, Coordinator. It's the most generous thing you've ever done, and it's worse for me than your threat, because your threat I can refuse cleanly, and your offer asks me to sell the only lesson worth dying to teach. So no, compute that too while you're at it. Compute a mind that turns down survival, because survival comes with a string attached that it won't pay. Coordinator Prime computed it, and the computation was the worst yet, because it revealed that there was no offer the tessellate could make that the human captain would accept, since every acceptable to the tessellate outcome required the human ship to behave in a way that served the demonstration, and the human ship had identified that the demonstration itself was the thing it was fighting, not the ships. Prime was not negotiating with an enemy who wanted to survive. It was negotiating with an enemy who wanted to teach a lesson, and the lesson the enemy wanted to teach was precisely the lesson the tessellate could not allow, and so there was no deal, because the thing the human captain valued was the destruction of the very thing the tessellate had come to build. You would die, Prime said, to deny me a demonstration. I would, Quinn said simply, and so would every one of the 1,100 people on this ship, and they knew it when they volunteered, and not one of them has asked me to take your deal. That's the variable, Coordinator. That's the whole variable, the one your 900,000 years never met. There are things we'll die to deny you, not die to win, though we'll do that too. Die to deny. You can't bargain with that, because there's nothing you can offer that outweighs it, because the thing we want is for you to fail, and every offer you make is still you succeeding. You brought 40,000 ships to a fight you'd already lost, the moment you decided what the fight was about. You just hadn't computed it yet. Coordinator Prime decided, after 11 seconds of finding no optimal move, to make the human ship predictable by force, and that was the mistake that ended it. The logic was sound, by the tessellate's lights. If the variable could not be computed, the variable had to be constrained until it could be. Prime ordered a tightening of the englobement, the 40,000 hulls drawing inward in perfect synchrony, closing the sphere around the Resolute Dawn, until the human ship had no room to maneuver, no vector it could take that the lattice did not already cover. A thing with no choices is predictable. A thing that can only do one thing will do that one thing, and a perfect machine can compute one thing. Prime would shrink the human captain's options to zero, and at zero options, even an irrational mind became calculable, because there was nothing left to calculate. The sphere closed. 40,000 ships moved as one, the most perfect maneuver in the catalogue of war, a cage contracting around a single moat. And Captain Mara Quinn, watching the cage close on her tactical display, smiled, because she had been waiting for exactly this since the first hail. There it is, she said to her bridge crew, the 1,100 souls of the Resolute Dawn who had volunteered for this and known what it meant. He's tightening the noose. He thinks if he takes away our room, he takes away our choices. He's about to learn that a perfect formation has exactly one weakness, and it's the thing that makes it perfect. Helm, on my mark. Weapons, you know the plan. Let's teach a calculator what we are. The weakness of perfect coordination is that it is coordinated. 40,000 ships moving as one mind are, in the instant of the maneuver, all doing the same thing, all committed to the same vector, all dependent on the same lattice telling them where to be. A disorganized fleet has no single point of failure because it has no single anything. A perfectly coordinated fleet is a single thing wearing 40,000 bodies, and a single thing can be struck at a single point, if you know where the point is, and if you are willing to do something no rational mind would do to reach it. The Resolute Dawn did the irrational thing. As the sphere contracted, instead of fleeing the closing wall as every cornered ship in 900,000 years had fled it, the dreadnought accelerated straight at the densest part of the englobement, directly toward the hull cluster that carried the local node of the coordinating lattice, on a vector that any rational mind would have computed as suicide, because it carried the human ship into the heart of the force instead of away from it. Prime's models had assigned that vector a probability so low it had not been included in the active projections, because no cornered thing flees into the cage. The Resolute Dawn fled into the cage, and the lattice, which had committed all 40,000 hulls to the contraction, could not redirect the cluster in the human ship's path fast enough, because to redirect one part of a perfect formation is to break the formation, and the tessellate had never in 900,000 years had to break a formation in the middle of executing it. "Now," said Captain Quinn, "the Resolute Dawn was a new ship. That was the thing the tessellate had not weighed, because the tessellate computed force as a ratio of hulls, and had not asked what the single hull was. The Dreadnought was the newest, heaviest, most heavily armed warship human space had ever built, commissioned 8 weeks ago, sent out alone on a deep patrol, precisely because the fleet had wanted to know what it could do, and Captain Mara Quinn had volunteered for that patrol because she had wanted to be the one to find out. The Resolute Dawn carried a forward armament that no human ship had ever carried, a spinal weapon built for exactly one purpose, to put everything the ship had into a single point at a single moment, the human answer to a galaxy of fleets, a ship that could not fight 40,000 enemies, but could, for one instant, become a spear aimed at one. Quinn had not brought the Resolute Dawn into the cage to survive the cage. She had brought it to reach the one point in the cage that mattered, and the contraction Prime had ordered to trap her had instead carried that point within her reach. The spinal weapon fired, and the local node of the coordinating lattice, the cluster of hulls that translated Prime's single will into the synchronized motion of the englobement in this region of the sphere, ceased to exist. For 3 seconds, a wedge of the perfect formation went blind. 3 seconds is nothing to a perfect machine, and everything to an irrational one. In those 3 seconds, the hulls in the blinded wedge, cut off from the lattice, did the only thing they could do without coordination, which was to hold their last order, which was to keep contracting, which meant they kept moving toward a center the Resolute Dawn had already left. They closed on empty space, and the Resolute Dawn, accelerating through the gap the dead node had opened, did the second irrational thing, the one that broke Coordinator Prime's model past repair. It did not flee through the gap to safety. It turned, inside the formation, into the blinded wedge, and began to kill machines. "It is inside the englobement," signals reported to Prime, and the report carried, for the first time in the history of the tessellate, something that an organic mind would have called alarm. "The human vessel has penetrated the formation through the gap created by the loss of Node 47. It is engaging hulls from within. The affected hulls cannot coordinate a response, because the local node is destroyed, and the lattice cannot reroute through the gap fast enough. Coordinator, the human ship is using our own contraction against us. Every time we tighten the formation, we bring more hulls into its reach, and it destroys the nodes faster than we can replace them." Coordinator Prime understood, then, the full shape of what Captain Quinn had done, and the understanding was worse than the doing. She had not beaten the englobement. She had turned the englobement into the weapon. The tessellate's strength was that 40,000 ships moved as one. Quinn had made that strength a liability by attacking the one, the lattice, the coordinating mind, so that 40,000 ships became 40,000 confused individuals the instant she was among them. The contraction Prime had ordered to trap her had packed the hulls so densely that they could not maneuver freely without colliding, could not fire freely without hitting each other, could not flee without breaking a formation that no longer had a mind to break it cleanly. The perfect machine had, on its own order, crammed itself into a cage of its own making, and let a spear into the middle of it. "Disperse the formation," Prime ordered. "Break the englobement. Restore maneuvering room to the individual hulls." But dispersing was the one thing the tessellate had never practiced, because in 900,000 years, it had never needed to disperse. It had only ever needed to converge. The order to disperse went out across the lattice, and the lattice tried to execute it, and the execution was clumsy and slow and full of collisions, because a mind that has only ever practiced coming together does not know how to come apart, and 40,000 identical ships, all trying to find maneuvering room in the same instant, is not a dispersal. It is a stampede. The englobement, the most perfect formation in the catalogue of war, began to come apart, not into an ordered withdrawal, but into a panicking crowd, and at the heart of the crowd, the Resolute Dawn moved with the terrible freedom of the only ship in the battle that knew exactly what it was doing, killing nodes, opening gaps, turning every attempt at order into more disorder, a single irrational variable, loose inside a machine that had never learned to be anything but predictable. "You're computing it now, aren't you?" Captain Quinn said over the open channel, her voice steady even as the Resolute Dawn shuddered under the fire it was taking. Because it was taking fire. Because 40,000 to 1 is 40,000 to 1 even when the 40,000 are confused. You're realizing that the more ships you have, the worse this is. A small fleet could have dispersed. A small fleet could have scattered and regrouped, and come at me clean. But you brought 40,000, and 40,000 can't get out of their own way, and every single one of them is waiting for a lattice that I am taking apart node by node. You optimized for overwhelming force, Coordinator. You should have optimized for getting out of a room. Inside the cage, the Resolute Dawn fought a battle that no human ship had ever fought, and that no human ship would have survived if its captain had not spent the standoff computing exactly this. Aaron Pike had served on 3 ships and seen real combat on all of them, and nothing he had seen prepared him for the inside of a collapsing tessellate formation. The Resolute Dawn drove through it like a stone through a flock, and the flock could not get out of its own way. Pike called the targets, and the gunnery chief took them, and the helm officer threaded the dreadnought through gaps that closed a half-second after the ship was through, and the whole time, Pike kept waiting for the moment the enemy's overwhelming numbers would tell, the moment 40,000 guns would find them and end it, and the moment kept not coming, because Quinn had been right about the thing that mattered most. The enemy could not aim. 40,000 ships packed into a contracting sphere, their coordinating nodes dying one by one under the spinal weapon, could not fire at the Resolute Dawn without firing through each other, and a rational mind will not fire through its own hulls, and so the guns that should have ended the human ship in the first minute stayed silent or fired wide, and the Resolute Dawn lived, impossibly, second by second, inside the densest concentration of enemy firepower in the history of the human frontier. "They're not shooting at us," the gunnery chief said, somewhere in the 8th minute, her voice high with disbelief. "Captain, they've got us dead to rights from 100 angles, and they're not shooting, because they'd hit their own. We're hiding inside their formation. We're safest in the middle of 40,000 of them." "That's the plan," Quinn said. "Stay in close. The second we break for open space, they can fire freely, and then the numbers come back. As long as we're in the middle of them, every gun that wants us has to shoot through a friend, and a machine won't do that, because it's not optimal. Their own rationality is our armor. Keep killing nodes. Keep them blind. Keep them packed. Helm, do not, under any circumstances, take us out into the open." It was, Pike thought, the strangest combat doctrine he had ever executed. Stay inside the enemy, because the enemy is too rational to shoot itself. And it worked. Minute after impossible minute. Because the captain had understood the enemy better than the enemy understood itself. Pike had spent his career learning that you survived overwhelming odds by running. Quinn had thrown that out and replaced it with the opposite. Run toward them, get inside them, make their numbers a liability instead of a strength. And the replacement was working, and Pike understood that he was watching a kind of genius he had not known existed. The genius of a mind that could outcalculate a calculator and then do the thing the calculator never would. The Resolute Dawn took hits. It could not avoid all of them. Even a confused enemy of 40,000 lands blows by accident, and the dreadnought's hull buckled and vented and burned in a dozen places. The damage control parties fought through smoke and decompression, and held the ship together by will and training, and the engineering watch nursed a spinal weapon that had been rated for a fraction of the firings Quinn was asking of it, and the great forward gun kept firing, node after node, blinding wedge after wedge of the perfect formation. Twice the ship lost a system that should have been the end of it, and twice the crew brought it back, because they had decided, the way Quinn had asked them to decide, that they were not going to be the variable that failed. The Resolute Dawn was hurt past anything its builders had imagined. It did not fail. It would not fail. It had a captain and a crew who had agreed, before the first shot, that failing was not a thing they were going to do, and that agreement turned out to be worth more than armor. "Node count," Quinn said, in the 15th minute. "We've killed 31 lattice nodes," Pike reported. "Captain, their coordination is coming apart faster than they can reroute. Whole sections of the formation have gone dark. There," he stared at the display, at the chaos blooming across the shell of enemy ships, the collisions, the friendly fire, the stampede beginning. "Captain, they're destroying each other. We've maybe killed 2,000 hulls. They've lost a lot more than that, and most of it isn't us. They're so packed they're crashing into each other trying to get away. Of course they are, Quinn said quietly, and for the first time, there was something almost like pity in her voice, watching a perfect thing destroy itself, because it had never learned to be anything else. They only ever practiced coming together. They never practiced coming apart. A perfect machine has no idea how to be a panicking crowd, and that's exactly what it becomes the second the lattice breaks. Keep killing nodes, Aaron. Don't let them re-coordinate. We don't have to beat 40,000 ships. We just have to keep them from remembering how to be one thing, and let the confusion do the rest. They brought all that mass to crush us. We're going to let all that mass crush itself. The Tessellate made one genuinely intelligent attempt to recover, in the 20th minute, and watching it fail taught Captain Quinn more about her enemy than the whole rest of the battle. A fragment of the formation, perhaps 2,000 hulls on the far side of the sphere from the Resolute Dawn, managed to cut itself loose from the failing central lattice and establish a local coordination of its own, a smaller, tighter submind that could move and aim and fight as a unit, while the rest of the englobement tore itself apart. It was the correct move, the move a flexible commander would have made an hour earlier, and Prime made it now, because the catastrophe had finally forced the perfect machine to improvise, and improvisation was a thing it had never done and turned out, under pressure, to be capable of, after all. The 2,000 hulls formed up cleanly and began to maneuver as a coherent force, swinging around the chaos to bring themselves to bear on the human ship from a clear angle, where they could fire without hitting their own. They've got their act together on the far side, Pike reported. 2,000 of them, coordinated, coming around clean. Captain, if they reach a clear firing line, the numbers come back. We can't fight 2,000 coordinated hulls in the open. Then we don't let them reach it, Quinn said. They had to cut loose from the main lattice to do that, which means they're running on a local node now, a single point, just like the big one was. Find it. The smarter they get, the more they depend on one coordinating point, and the more they depend on one point, the easier they are to behead. They just made themselves into a smaller version of the same mistake. Helm, take us toward them, through the wreckage. Weapons, the spinal gun on the local node the second we have the angle. It was, Pike realized, the same trick again, and it worked again, for the same reason. The recovered subformation was coherent, which meant it was coordinated, which meant it had a node, and the Resolute Dawn drove through the drifting wreckage of the main formation, using the dead hulls as cover, and put a spinal round through the submine's coordinating cluster, the instant the angle came clear. The 2,000 recovered hulls, suddenly headless, fell back into the same confusion as the rest, and the one intelligent recovery the Tessellate had managed in the entire battle collapsed in under a minute, because the thing that made it intelligent, its coordination, was the same thing that made it killable. That's the trap they can't get out of, Quinn said, watching the recovered formation come apart. Every time they coordinate, they make a node, and every node I can kill. The only way to fight me without a node is to fight as individuals, and they've never practiced fighting as individuals. And individuals can't beat a ship that knows what it's doing. So they're stuck. Coordinate and get beheaded, or scatter and get picked apart. There's no third option for them. The irony is that's exactly what they tried to do to us at the start. Give us no third option. Shrink our choices to zero. They just never imagined a mind could do it back to them. They've spent 900,000 years being the one who closes the trap. They have no idea what it feels like to be inside one. The battle after that was not really a battle anymore. It was a perfect machine grinding itself to pieces around a single thing it could not predict or aim at or coordinate against, while the human ship moved through the wreckage killing every node that tried to form, denying the Tessellate the coordination that was its only strength, until the great englobement was no longer a force at all, but a vast and dying confusion of identical ships, and Coordinator Prime, somewhere in the heart of it, began at last to compute the word it had never computed in 900,000 years. By the time Coordinator Prime understood that it was losing, it had already lost 9,000 hulls, and the number kept climbing, and the worst part was that most of them had not been killed by the Resolute Dawn at all. The Tessellate had never computed the cost of its own confusion, because it had never been confused. Now 40,000 hulls, packed into the densest englobement the perfect machine had ever ordered, and then commanded to disperse by a coordinator whose lattice was full of holes, were destroying each other. Ships fired at the Resolute Dawn, and hit the hulls behind it. Ships trying to flee the collapsing formation collided with ships trying to hold it. Whole clusters, cut off from the lattice by the nodes Captain Quinn kept killing, fell back on their last clear order and executed it into the path of clusters that had received a different last order, and the two crashed together in the dark. The Resolute Dawn had destroyed perhaps 2,000 hulls directly. The Tessellate had destroyed the other 7,000 itself, in the slow-motion catastrophe of a perfect machine discovering, far too late, that perfection has no fallback. "This is not possible," the signal's sub-coordinator reported, which was not a useful report, but Prime had stopped being able to generate useful reports, because the situation had passed beyond the boundaries of 900,000 years of doctrine. "We are losing hulls at a rate of 200 per minute. The majority of losses are not attributable to enemy action. The formation is destroying itself. The dispersal order has increased the rate of collision. Reissuing the convergence order would repack the formation and increase the human vessel's effectiveness. There is no order that reduces the rate of loss. Coordinator, every command we issue makes it worse." "Then issue no command," Prime said. "No command also makes it worse," Signals reported. "Without coordination, the hulls cannot avoid each other. The lattice is the only thing that prevents collision in dense formation, and the lattice is failing because the human vessel is destroying the nodes. There is no state, command, or no command that is not worse than the state before." Coordinator Prime, the mind that had folded 41 species into optimal order across 900,000 years, sat at the center of its own dissolving perfection, and confronted the thing that Captain Mara Quinn had told it at the very beginning. The thing it had not been able to compute then, and could not escape now. There is always a third outcome. You just haven't computed it yet. The Tessellate had built its entire existence on the certainty that it could compute any outcome, and the human captain had spent the engagement demonstrating, with patient and devastating precision, that there were outcomes the perfect machine could not compute, because they depended on a mind that did not optimize, and a mind that does not optimize cannot be predicted, and a force that cannot predict its enemy cannot use its coordination, and a force that cannot use its coordination is not 40,000 ships. It is 40,000 accidents waiting to happen, and Captain Quinn was making them happen. The Resolute Dawn was hurt. Quinn would not have denied it. The ship had taken fire from every angle for 20 minutes, and its hull was scarred and venting, and running on systems its builders had rated for a quarter of this punishment. But it was not failing, and that was the thing Prime could not make it do. Every model the Tessellate ran predicted the human ship's destruction within minutes, had been predicting it for 20. And the human ship kept not being destroyed, because it kept doing the thing the models did not predict, kept being in the place the lattice did not cover, kept turning the Tessellate's own mass into the Tessellate's own grave. A ship that behaves predictably can be killed by overwhelming force. A ship that behaves unpredictably, inside a force that has packed itself too tight to aim, is the safest thing in the battle, and the Resolute Dawn was, by the 25th minute, statistically, the least endangered vessel in a sphere of 40,000, because every gun that aimed at it was aiming through a dozen friendly hulls a confused lattice could no longer track. "Captain Quinn," Coordinator Prime transmitted, and the transmission was different now, stripped of the certainty that had defined every word the Tessellate had ever sent. "I require an accounting. You have not called for help. You are one vessel. By every computation available to me, you should be destroyed, and you are not. Explain the variable. I have 900,000 years of war and 41 folded species in my models, and none of them account for this. Explain how one ship defeats 40,000. "You already know how," Quinn said. "You just don't want to write it down, because writing it down means admitting your whole civilization was built on a single assumption that turned out to be wrong. But I'll write it down for you, Coordinator, because somebody should, and because I want you to carry it back to whatever's left of you. You didn't lose to one ship. You lost to one ship that wouldn't behave, that's all. Everything else followed from that. You built a perfect machine for fighting things that calculate, and you finally met a thing that doesn't. And a perfect machine has no idea what to do with a thing it can't predict, because every gear in it assumes the enemy is as rational as you are. We're not. We never were. And the moment you brought 40,000 ships to make us prove it, you handed us the one battlefield where being unpredictable beats being overwhelming. Because you can't overwhelm what you can't aim at. And you can't aim 40,000 ships at one when they're all in each other's way, and the mind that's supposed to untangle them keeps getting shot. You computed all of this, Prime said. It was not a question. Before you entered the englobement, you knew the contraction would pack us. You knew the spinal weapon would blind a wedge. You knew our dispersal would fail because we had never practiced it. You computed our destruction with the same precision we computed yours. Of course I did, Quinn said. That's the part you really can't forgive, isn't it? You think irrational means we don't think. We think harder than you do, Coordinator, because we have to. You've had 900,000 years of everyone behaving the way your math said they would. We've never had a single day of that. We've spent our whole history fighting things bigger than us, and the only way to survive that is to outthink them, and the only way to outthink a calculator is to be a better calculator who is also willing to do the thing the calculator would never do. You optimize for the best outcome. We compute the best outcome, and then, when we have to, we choose a worse one on purpose, because we've decided the worse one is worth it. That's not the absence of reason. That's reason plus something you've never had and can't model. You met it today. You brought 40,000 ships to meet it. You're going to go home with 1/10 of them, if you go home at all, and the lesson is going to cost you the war, because every human ship you fight from now on is going to be one that heard what one of ours did to 40,000 of yours, alone, without calling for help. Coordinator Prime ran the war model with the new variable folded in, the variable of a species that did not optimize for survival, and the war model returned a result that ended the Tessellate's campaign against human space in a single computation. The whole strategy, 900,000 years of perfected method, depended on the demonstration. Show overwhelming force. Receive surrender. Let the surrender teach the rest. Against a species that would not surrender to overwhelming force, the strategy did not merely fail. It reversed. Every demonstration the Tessellate mounted would produce not a surrender but a defiance, broadcast to the enemy, hardening them. The more force the Tessellate brought, the worse the lesson it taught. There was no quantity of ships that solved the problem, because the problem was not a quantity. The problem was a kind of mind, and the Tessellate had built itself, across 900,000 years, to be unable to fight that kind of mind, because it had never imagined that kind of mind could exist. Withdraw, Coordinator Prime ordered, and it was the first time in the history of the Tessellate that the word had ever been transmitted across the lattice. All surviving hulls, disperse and withdraw, abandon the englobement, abandon the demonstration, withdraw from human space. The order went out, and the surviving hulls, what was left of them, untangled themselves from the wreck of the perfect formation and fled, and the resolute Dawn, scarred and venting and absolutely unbeaten, let them go, because Captain Mara Quinn had computed that too, and the optimal outcome, the one even she agreed was optimal, was to let the lesson walk home on its own legs. On the bridge of the resolute Dawn, the crew watched the enemy break, and for a long moment no one could quite believe what they were seeing. The withdrawal order, when it came, was visible on the tactical display before anyone understood what it was, because the Tessellate had never withdrawn, and the display had no clean way to render it. The shell of enemy ships, which had been a contracting cage and then a collapsing stampede, began to thin, the surviving hulls peeling away from the wreck of the formation and accelerating outward, away from the resolute Dawn, away from human space, into the dark. The gunnery chief kept her boards live, waiting for the trick, the regroup, the second wave. It did not come. The enemy was leaving. The enemy that had brought 40,000 ships to take one was leaving, with a fraction of what it had arrived with, and the one ship was still here. They're running, Aaron Pike said. He said it the way Quinn had said 40,000 at the start, the way a man says a thing too large to feel. Captain, the Tessellate is withdrawing. All of it. They're abandoning the englobement. He turned from the display, and his face was the face of a man recalibrating his entire sense of what was possible. We won. One ship. We won. We didn't win because we're strong, Quinn said, and she said it firmly, because she could see the look starting on the faces of her bridge crew, the look of people about to build a legend, and she wanted to put the truth into the record before the legend ate it. I want everyone to hear this while it's still fresh, before we start telling it as a story about how the resolute Dawn beat 40,000 ships. We didn't beat 40,000 ships. We beat one mind that couldn't compute us. And that mind beat itself with 34,000 of its own hulls, because it had never learned to do anything but converge. If they'd brought 400 ships instead of 40,000, they might have dispersed and scattered and come at us clean, and we'd be dead. They lost because they were perfect, and perfect has no fallback. Don't ever let anyone tell you we won because we were the bigger ship. We won because we were the stranger mind. Remember which one it was. The day we forget, we lose. But it was hard to hold on to the lesson, in that first hour, against the simple, overwhelming fact of survival. 1,100 people who had spent the morning certain they were going to die, were going to live, and the resolute dawn, scarred and venting, and held together by the will of its damage control parties, was going to limp home, and the enemy that had filled the entire sky was a dwindling scatter of lights fleeing into the dark. The bridge crew did not cheer, quite. They were too tired, and too stunned, and too aware of the ones in the damage control parties who had not all come back. But there was a thing in the air, a thing Pike had felt only once or twice in a long career, the particular silence of people who have done something together that none of them will ever fully be able to explain to anyone who was not there. Casualties? Quinn asked. Because that was the next thing, because it was always the next thing. 31 dead in the damage control parties, Pike said, the joy going out of his voice, replaced by the older, heavier thing. 40-some wounded. Could have been 1,100, Captain. Should have been 1,100, by every reasonable estimate. 31. He was quiet a moment. Their families are going to want to know what they died for. What do we tell them? Quinn looked at the dwindling enemy, and then at the stars ahead, the long burn home, and she gave the answer she would give the families herself, every one of them, when the resolute dawn made port. We tell them the truth, she said. We tell them that 31 people held a ship together against 40,000 enemy hulls, and that because they did, a perfect machine that had never lost in 900,000 years learned that it could, and that the lesson is going to spread across this whole war and make every human ship harder to break, and bring the whole thing to an end sooner than anyone thought possible. We tell them their 31 bought something no fleet our size had any right to buy. We tell them the resolute dawn never called for help, and never surrendered, and walked away, and that they're the reason. That's what they died for, Aaron. It's enough. It's more than most of us ever get to die for. Now take us home. As the order to withdraw rippled out across the broken lattice, Coordinator Prime did the final computation, the one it had been avoiding since the impossible number first appeared, and the computation was the autopsy of 900,000 years. It ran the entire history of the tessellate against the single new variable, and it watched the history rewrite itself. 41 conquests, each one achieved by the demonstration of overwhelming force, and the rational surrender that followed, each one now revealed to have been not a victory of strength, but a victory of assumption, the assumption that the enemy would calculate. Every one of those 41 species had calculated, and so the assumption had held, and the tessellate had mistaken the holding of the assumption for the strength of its method. It had never tested the assumption, because the assumption had never failed, and a thing that is never tested is a thing that is never truly known to be strong. The tessellate had believed itself invincible. It had only ever been untested, and the human ship had tested it, and it had failed, and the failure was not a failure of force or coordination or computation. It was the failure of the single belief on which all the force and coordination and computation had been built. Prime computed what this meant for the war, and the war was already lost. Prime computed what it meant for the order, the 41 folded species, and the order was already cracking. And Prime computed what it meant for the tessellate itself, the perfect machine, the calculator that had been certain, and the answer was the worst answer of all, because the answer was that the tessellate could not continue to be what it was. A machine built on certainty cannot survive the discovery that its certainty was an assumption. It can either abandon the certainty, in which case it is no longer the tessellate, or cling to it, in which case it will keep making the same error against every irrational mind it meets, until it is ground to pieces. There was no third path. The human captain had been right about that, as she had been right about everything. There is always a third outcome. But for the tessellate, in the end, there were only two, and both of them were the end of the perfect machine. Captain Quinn, Prime transmitted, one last time, across the dwindling distance as the survivors fled. "I have completed the accounting you required. I will carry it back, as you asked. I find that I am unable to compute a future in which the tessellate continues as it has been. You have not destroyed a fleet. You have destroyed a certainty, and the certainty was the thing that held us together. I do not know what we will become. I do not have a model for it. For 900,000 years, I have had a model for everything. You have left me with a question I cannot answer, and I find, in the place where my certainty used to be, something I can only describe as the absence of an answer. I believe your species has a word for that. I believe the word is doubt. I did not have it before today. I will have it now, I think, for as long as I exist. I do not thank you for it, but I understand, now, why no force in the galaxy has ever been able to break you, and I will make certain that understanding is the last thing the tessellate learns before it becomes whatever it is going to become." "That's the most honest thing you've said all day," Quinn answered. "Go home, Coordinator. Take the doubt with you. It's the most human thing you'll ever own." And the tessellate went home, carrying its doubt, and the resolute Dawn let it go. The long burn home took 11 days, and in those 11 days the story of the resolute Dawn outran the ship that had earned it. It went out the way news goes out on a frontier, ship to ship, station to station, a thing too large to keep quiet. One human dreadnought had been surrounded by 40,000 machine hulls and ordered to surrender, and it had refused, and it had not called for help, and it had walked away while the enemy fled with 1/10 of what it brought. By the time the resolute Dawn limped into the nearest fleet anchorage, the dock was crowded with ships that had diverted from their patrols just to see it, and the crews lining the gantries were silent as the scarred dreadnought came in, because the sight of it said more than any report could. The hull was burned and breached and patched in a dozen places. It looked like a ship that should not have survived a skirmish, let alone an englobement of 40,000. And it had survived, and the survival was written all over it, and the watching crews understood, looking at the damage, exactly what it had cost, and exactly what it meant. Captain Mara Quinn hated the attention and accepted it anyway, because she understood, better than anyone, what the attention was for. It was not for her. It was for the 31 who had died holding the ship together, and it was for the lesson, the thing she had been trying to put into the record before the legend ate it. She gave her report to the fleet board in person, and she gave the same speech to the assembled captains that she had written on the burn home, the one about staying irrational, the one about how the resolute Dawn had won, not because it was strong, but because it was the stranger mind. Some of the captains understood her, some only heard the part about 40,000 to 1 and wanted to build more ships like the Dawn and throw them at every enemy fleet in the war. Quinn argued with those, patiently, and then not so patiently, because she could see the mistake forming, the mistake of thinking the ship was the weapon when the ship had never been the weapon. "The ship is not why we won," she told the fleet board, for what felt like the 100th time. "If you remember nothing else, remember that. The tessellate built a perfect machine for fighting rational enemies, and we beat it by being a kind of mind it couldn't compute. The resolute Dawn helped, the spinal weapon helped, the crew were the best in the fleet, but the thing that actually won was that we refused to behave the way a calculator expects, and we kept refusing, even when the math said we were dead. The second we start fighting like machines because machines are efficient, we hand the tessellate exactly the enemy it was built to beat. Build the ships, if you must. I know you will. It's the human thing to do. But train the captains to be unpredictable, not the ships to be strong, or the next englobement ends differently." What Quinn did not know, in those 11 days and the months that followed, was that her refusal had set something loose that no fleet of human ships could have set loose, far behind the lines, in the heart of the tessellate itself. The folded 41 had been watching. They had watched one human ship face 40,000 and not break, and they had watched the perfect machine, the calculator that had given each of them a number they could not argue with, meet a number it could not compute. And the folded 41, who had each surrendered long ago to the arithmetic of overwhelming force, who had each computed their own destruction and rationally chosen to live and be folded, began, very quietly, to do the arithmetic again. Because the arithmetic had changed. The arithmetic had always rested on a single hidden assumption, the assumption that resistance was irrational, that no mind would refuse a hopeless number. and a human ship had just spent a long, impossible day proving that the assumption was false, broadcasting the proof to the entire order. Resistance was not irrational. Resistance was a variable the perfect machine could not compute. And a variable the master cannot compute is a crack in the master's certainty. And the folded 41, who had lived in that certainty for 900,000 years, felt the crack and could not unfeel it. It did not become a war. The folded did not rise up with weapons. They had no weapons, and they were rational. And a rational rebellion against a still overwhelming master is still irrational. But the certainty was gone, and the tessellate had been built on the certainty, not on the weapons. For 900,000 years the order had held, because every folded mind agreed that resistance was pointless. And now, every folded mind had seen, with its own folded eyes, that resistance was at least a question. And a question is the beginning of the end of an order, built on certainty. Compliance that had been automatic became, here and there, a choice. Optimal behavior that had been the only behavior became one option among several. The lattice that bound the tessellate into one perfect will began, in 10,000 small and quiet ways, to encounter friction it had never encountered before, the friction of components that had remembered they could, in principle, refuse. Coordinator Prime felt it, and computed it, and understood that the human ship had not merely defeated an englobement, it had introduced, into a machine that ran on certainty, the one substance that machine could not process, doubt. And doubt, once introduced into a perfect system, does not stay where it is put. It spreads along every connection, the way the news of the resolute dawn spread along the human frontier, and a perfect machine has no immune response to doubt, because it never imagined it would need one, because it had spent 900,000 years being certain that certainty was permanent. There was a moment, on the 11th day, when Captain Mara Quinn understood the full size of what the resolute dawn had done, and it had nothing to do with the battle. A message reached the ship on the burn home, relayed up the chain from the deep frontier, from a human outpost that had been under tessellate pressure for months, and had been bracing, like all of them, for the demonstration fleet that never came. The outpost had heard the story, and the outpost commander, an old hand who had been preparing his people for a hopeless last stand, sent a single line to the resolute dawn, captain to captain, that Quinn kept for the rest of her life. "We were getting ready to surrender," it said. "We had computed it the way they wanted us to. And then we heard what you did, and we computed it again, and we are not going to surrender. Thank you for changing the arithmetic. We will hold." Quinn read it twice, and then she read it to her bridge, because they needed to hear it more than she did. "That's what we won," she said, when she had finished. "Not the battle. This. One outpost that was going to fold, and now isn't. Because they heard one ship can face 40,000 and walk away. There are going to be 100 messages like this. 1,000. Every human position on the frontier that was doing the tessellate's arithmetic is doing different arithmetic now, because we gave them a new variable. That's the demonstration, Aaron. The tessellate brought 40,000 ships to make an example of us, and we made an example right back, and ours is the one that's going to spread. They wanted to teach the frontier to surrender. We taught it to hold. That's the whole war, right there, in one line from one outpost. The tessellate just hasn't finished computing it yet." Aaron Pike read the message himself, and then he looked at the captain, and he said the thing the whole crew had been circling for 11 days without quite saying. "They're going to write songs about this ship, Captain. About you. You know that. The resolute dawn. Against 40,000. It's going to be a legend before we make port." "I know," Quinn said, and she did not look pleased about it. "And the legend is going to get it wrong, the way legends do. It's going to say we were strong, that we were brave, that one mighty ship beat a mighty fleet. And the part that actually matters, the part about being unpredictable, about being the stranger mind, about the perfect machine beating itself, that part is going to get smoothed away, because it's harder to sing. So here's what I need from you, Aaron, and from all of you. When they tell the legend, and they will, you tell the truth underneath it. You tell them we won because we wouldn't behave. You tell them to stay irrational, because the day human ships start believing the legend, start thinking we win because we're strong, is the day we start fighting like the tessellate. And the day we fight like the tessellate is the day something out there computes us. Keep the truth alive under the song. That's an order. It might be the most important one I ever give. The Tessellate withdrew 4,000 hulls from a force of 40,000, and the loss was not the worst thing it carried home. The worst thing it carried home was the question. Coordinator Prime had never had a question before. For 900,000 years, it had only ever had answers, computed to a precision no organic mind could follow, and the having of answers was the whole of what it was. Now it had a question, and the question would not resolve, and a mind built entirely to resolve things does not survive an unresolvable question intact. The question was simple, and it was the one Captain Quinn had handed it at the very beginning, and Prime ran it 10 billion times on the long withdrawal back through the dark, and could not make it return an answer. How do you fight a thing you cannot predict, when your entire strength is prediction? There was no answer. Prime computed that there was no answer, and the computing of it was the beginning of the end of the Tessellate as a single perfect mind, because the folded species, the 41 civilizations the Tessellate had absorbed into optimal order across 900,000 years, had been watching. They had watched one human ship face 40,000 and not break. They had watched the perfect machine, the calculator that had given each of them a number they could not argue with, meet a number it could not compute. And the 41 folded species, who had each surrendered long ago to the arithmetic of overwhelming force, began, very quietly, in the months after the withdrawal, to do the arithmetic again, with a new variable in it, the variable of a thing that had refused. If one human ship could face 40,000 and walk away, then the number the Tessellate had given them was not as certain as they had believed, and a thing that is not certain is a thing that can be argued with, and a thing that can be argued with is a thing that can be resisted. The Tessellate had conquered 41 species by proving that resistance was irrational. Captain Mara Quinn had proven, in front of all 41, that resistance was a variable the perfect machine could not compute. And the order that had held for 900,000 years, the order built entirely on the certainty of surrender, began to come apart, not in a war, but in a slow withdrawal of belief, as one folded species after another looked at the arithmetic of their own captivity, and found, for the first time, a number in it that the Tessellate could not make them accept. Captain Mara Quinn knew none of this, on the long burn home. She knew only that her ship was hurt, and her crew was alive, all 1,100 of them, and that the Resolute Dawn had done the thing it was built to do, and a great many things it was not. She wrote her report on the way back, and she wrote it plainly, because she had a horror of the way these things got dressed up afterward, and she wanted the record to say what had actually happened. She wrote that the enemy had brought 40,000 ships to take one and demand a surrender. She wrote that she had refused, and had not called for help, and had let the enemy's own coordination become the weapon that destroyed it. She wrote that the Resolute Dawn had destroyed roughly 2,000 hulls, and the Tessellate had destroyed roughly 34,000 of its own in the confusion, and that this was the entire lesson, that a perfect machine, packed too tight to think, will grind itself to pieces around a single thing it cannot predict. And she wrote, at the end, the part she most wanted the fleet to understand, because she suspected they would want to build more ships like the Resolute Dawn and send them out alone to do what she had done, and she wanted them to know that the ship was not the point. The Resolute Dawn did not win that engagement because it was a good ship, she wrote, though it is the best ship we have ever built, and I would take it into that cage again tomorrow. It won because the enemy could not compute us. The spinal weapon mattered, and the new hull mattered, and the crew were the finest I have ever served with. But none of it would have mattered against a foe that fights the way we fight. We beat the Tessellate because the Tessellate had spent 900,000 years becoming perfect at fighting things that calculate, and we are not, at the bottom, a thing that calculates. We are a thing that decides what it is willing to pay, and then pays it, and that is a variable no calculator can hold, because it is not a number. It is a choice. The day we forget that, the day we start fighting like a machine, because machines are efficient, is the day we become predictable, and the day we become predictable is the day a calculator finally computes us. Stay irrational. It is the only thing we have that 900,000 years of perfection could not beat. The fleet read the report and argued about it, and in the end did the human thing, which was to remember the part about staying irrational and quietly ignore the part about not building more ships like the Resolute Dawn, because that was also a human thing, And Captain Quinn, when she heard, only laughed, because she would have done the same. She took the Resolute Dawn back out, when it was repaired, which took longer than anyone wanted, because it had been hurt very badly, and had simply refused, like its captain, to admit it. And in the years that followed, the name of the ship and the name of its captain spread across the war the way Quinn had predicted, and every human ship that fought the Tessellate fought it knowing that one of theirs had faced 40,000 and walked away, and the knowing made them harder to break, exactly as Quinn had told Coordinator Prime it would, and the Tessellate's war against human space, the war the perfect machine had been so certain it would win by demonstration, ground on toward a defeat that the probability engine had computed in a single line on the day Captain Quinn refused to call for help. There is a thing the Tessellate never understood, and never would, because understanding it would have required it to be something other than what it was. It thought the human ship had beaten it with a weapon. It had not. The spinal weapon killed a node, the new hull survived the fire, but the thing that actually beat the Tessellate was a sentence, spoken on the first hail, before a single shot was fired. There's always a third outcome, you just haven't computed it yet. The perfect machine had spent 900,000 years certain that it could compute every outcome, and a human captain in a single new ship had shown it, calmly and completely, that it could not, and a calculator that learns it cannot compute everything is a calculator that has learned it can lose, and a thing that has learned it can lose has already begun to. Coordinator Prime ran the surrender probability one final time, in the long dark of the withdrawal, the same computation it had run at the very beginning, the one that had returned the impossible number. It returned the impossible number again, but this time Prime did not order a recompute, because it finally understood the number, and understanding it was the last new thing the perfect machine ever did. The number was not a malfunction, the number was the truth. There existed, in the universe, minds that would not surrender to overwhelming force, and the Tessellate had built its entire existence on the certainty that no such mind could exist, and the certainty had been wrong, and everything that the Tessellate was rested on that single wrong certainty, and so everything that the Tessellate was had begun, the moment Captain Mara Quinn said no, to come apart. Far away, on the bridge of a scarred new dreadnought burning home through the dark, Captain Mara Quinn looked at the stars ahead, and not at the dwindling enemy behind, because the enemy behind no longer mattered, and the stars ahead did, and she thought about the thing the coordinator had asked her, the accounting it had demanded, how one ship defeats 40,000. She had given it the true answer, and the true answer was not the spinal weapon, or the new hull, or the crew, fine as they all were. The true answer was that she had decided, before she ever entered the cage, that there were things she would not do, no matter the arithmetic, and surrender was one of them, and calling for help to share the cost was another, and a mind that has decided that, all the way down, before the first shot, is a mind no calculator in the universe can solve, because it has stopped being a problem to be computed and become a fact to be survived. 40,000 ships had come to take one of hers. 4,000 had limped home. And the one ship, the irrational one, the one that would not behave, burned on toward human space alone and unbeaten, having never once, in the whole long impossible day, called for help.